I live in Florida. I live near the beach. And when there is a meteor shower, I go to the beach and I lay out a blanket and I lay on that blanket and I look up at the stars and I watch the meteor shower. And I try to find shooting stars. So I love astronomy. I love the stars. I'm not very scientifically minded, but I like learning about astronomy. Sometimes you can not be very good at something, but still love it. So I have always had an interest in shooting stars, and I had this image one day of a star falling from the sky and a girl standing on her roof and watching it. But here's something very interesting. Well, I think it's interesting. The original story of Quintessence was a story within another story. I was writing a whole other book, and in that book, there was a series of books. And this was the story in that series of books. It was a series of books about a fallen star and how a girl had to save that star. But as I was writing that book, I became so infatuated and just fell in love with this story about the fallen star that I took that book out of the other book and I decided to write that book as its own book, and that's what became Quintessence. Did you follow that? All the book within the book that came out of the book that I wrote into a new book? That was Quintessence. And so it grew from there into its very own many-layered, big branching idea with astronomy and alchemy and junk shops and fallen stars and therapy and all sorts of things that I love and enjoy that I pulled together and ultimately turned into the story that you can read now. Choosing favorite characters is impossible. It's almost as hard as choosing which book that you've written is your favorite. I love all of my characters. I love them so much. Alma, of course, is very near and dear to my heart. She is very much like I was when I was a young person. I moved across the country. I was anxious. But Alma is like much more quiet and her anxiety is turned more inward. I was a lot louder and everybody knew how I felt. I wasn't really keeping a lot of things hidden. But I love Alma. I love Shireen. I love Hugo. I love Dustin. But I would have to say that the shopkeeper was my favorite character to write about. When I first turned in a draft of Quintessence, my editor actually said to me, I'm not so sure about this shopkeeper character. I don't really understand like where he's coming from and how he, enhances the story. What's his role here? He's taking up these pages, but he's not really doing much. Maybe you should take him out. And I was like, no, I don't want to take him out. I love him. So what I did instead, I just added more shopkeeper. I was like, okay, you don't understand where he's coming from? I will give him a fully fleshed out backstory. I'll put that in there. I'll give him point of view chapters. I'll give him more to do. I'll weave him into the storyline much more intricately. He's going to be a focus of this story. And I'm so glad I did because he is just so much fun to write. I love the things that he says. I love the many ways that he looks, and I love his ending. And all of those things formed through editing, through going back through the story and figuring out what needed to happen and what readers needed to know about this enigmatic, mysterious character. So I mentioned that when I was younger, I moved across the country. I moved from Philadelphia down to Florida, and I also had panic attacks. I had started having panic attacks even before that, when I was very young. I was about 9. And so anxiety was something that I was very familiar with. When I grew up, I became a therapist, and I work with a lot of people who have anxiety. It's the most common mental health illness in the United States, and it occurs for a lot of people starting when they are young, when they're children. And so I knew that this was an issue that was really relevant and that a lot of people experience and that a lot of people would be able to relate to. I didn't set out to write a story about anxiety. I didn't say, I'm going to write a story that teaches people about anxiety and that lets them know that this is an issue and that gives them education. I didn't do that. But Alma came to me with this issue. She had anxiety from the beginning, and I felt like that was something important that was sort of intrinsic to her journey, and I wanted to keep that in there. And once I decided that I was going to keep that she would have an anxiety issue, I wanted to make sure that I explained it well enough and that I explored it enough that readers would understand a little bit more what anxiety is, what a panic attack is, and that it's always okay to ask for help, and that there is help that's out there if you're struggling in that way, that it's not sort of a life sentence or that you're doomed to a life of anxiety or a miserable life or whatever, but that there are things that can be done, there are people who can help you, there are skills that you can learn, and that there are ways to have a really fulfilling and wonderful life no matter what you're experiencing. I love researching for books. I could go down research rabbit trails all day, every day. And I did do a lot of research for Quintessence. And a lot of the research actually informed the direction of the story. So I did a lot of research into astronomy. I learned about supernovas. I learned about the types of stars. I learned about runaway stars, which are stars that have been knocked out of orbit, usually by some huge cataclysmic event like a supernova, and that are speeding across the galaxy super, super fast. And that's how the starling becomes a runaway star, because I learned about that fact. I learned about how long it would take the sun to crash into the earth and how far away the nearest star other than the sun is. I learned all these facts and information, and I got to put them into the story, which was something that, as somebody who didn't study a lot of science but who's very interested in it, it was a fascinating journey to go on. And then I also got to learn a lot about alchemy. I got to read the writings of Paracelsus. Original books had a lot of his more quirkier ideas. There were sprites that lived in the air and mermaids in the water and salamanders in the fire. I got to read sort of the origins of alchemy, going all the way back to Aristotle. So I really got to dig into all of those different branches of science and pseudoscience and learn a little bit more. And like I said, it's funny how that those research topics end up becoming embedded in the story. Like, the story wouldn't be what it was if I hadn't learned those facts. And so things that you're interested in, they can become the foundation for new stories that you write. This is one of the #1 complaints that I've seen from adults about the story. And so I just want to tell every young reader out there, please do not sneak out of your house in the middle of the night for any reason. For any reason, even if you see a star fall out of the sky into your backyard, don't leave your house. Don't do it. This is intended to be purely a work of fiction. A lot of times in fantasy books, kids do really wacky stuff. They take big risks. They do things that you should never do in the real world. And this is one of those cases.